Hello, good evening everyone. Welcome to V2, the Institute for the Unstable Media, and welcome to this joyful event, the Sentient City book launch. Tonight's program is the fruit of a nice and very fruitful collaboration with the International Design Seminar 2011, and I would like to already upfront thank the organization behind this seminar for creating this opportunity with us. Of course, central to tonight's program will be a book presentation of the book Sentient City, Ubiquitous Computing, Architecture and the Future of Urban Space. And we have Mark Shepard in the house, editor of the book, to present the book itself to you. We have two more guests on the program tonight. One is Martijn de Waal, a media researcher, and he contributed an essay to the book on the future of urban space. And he will elaborate on this topic in his talk tonight. Our second guest is Michiel de Waal, who is a researcher on locative and mobile media in urban settings and lecturer at New Media Studies at Utrecht University. And we have invited him to moderate this evening tonight. So he will introduce both of our speakers a little bit more elaborately, as I just did. He will also handle questions from you, the audience, hopefully. And he will guide us towards a discussion with which we'll close the evening on the future of urban space between Martijn, Mark, and you. By then, we'll probably be very thirsty, which is why we've invited our production assistant, Alex Falk, to come up with a cocktail design for tonight's event. And he came up with this great recipe called the CCTV. Crème de cassis, tonic and vodka. So we'll serve that after the more formal part of this event, also with some finger food. But before we start drinking CCTVs, I think it's time to discuss technologies such as CCTV and in the light of the future of public space. So I would like to invite Michiel de Lange, our moderator, to the stage.
Thank you very much, Michel. Brief correction on my name, it's Michiel de Lange, but don't worry about it. Welcome everybody to this evening. So what are we going to do tonight? Well, obviously this is the Dutch book launch of the Sentient City, a book edited by Mark Shepard. Mark is an artist and architect, and we're very pleased to have you here tonight, Mark. Again, I should say the last time we met was in 2009 at the International Architectural Biennale here in Rotterdam. And Mark then already discussed some of the topics that that he has been developing over the last few years and that we'll be hearing and seeing more about this evening. So this publication, Sentient City, Ubiquitous Computing, Architecture and the Future of Urban Space. It is basically written in the wake of an exhibition that took place in 2009, was organized at the Architectural League of New York. And for this exhibition, 5 projects were commissioned to address the interrelation between urbanism and digital media technologies, and also to, provoke public debate about what kind of future do we actually want for our cities. As they are becoming more and more intertwined with various digital media technologies. In recent years, a lot of people have been discussing this topic of relation between media technologies and urbanism. So what are we actually speaking about? You can think, for instance, about your RFID chip card, which you might use to access various urban infrastructures and services, like the public transport, or maybe your customer card, or maybe you can access the highway with it, or access certain buildings with it. But you can also think about mobile communication networks and GPS, which you use perhaps to move around town and coordinate meetings with other people, and maybe find interesting spots nearby that are recommended to you on via some mobile app. Or you can think about omnipresent wireless internet networks that are all around us and that enable us to work not only at home or at the office, but in the sun, at a park bench, at least if your screen allows you to sit in the sun, or perhaps while traveling. So in the words of Mark Shepard, I quote him here, "As computing leaves the desktop and spills out onto the sidewalks, streets, and public spaces of the city, we increasingly find information processing capacity embedded within and distributed throughout the material fabric of everyday urban space. End of quote. Now, what does this idea of sentient city actually entail? I'll be very brief about it. I'm sure the speakers will say more about it. But sentience refers to the ability to feel or perceive subjectively. It's not necessarily self-awareness. So the sentient city is actually able to sense what is happening in it and also react to it in a more or less intelligent fashion. So what we are seeing here is the rise of urban infrastructures that are, again in the words of Mark Shepard, capable of sensing and responding to the events and activities transpiring around them, imbued with the capacity to remember, correlate, and anticipate. This near-future sentient city is envisioned as being capable of reflexively monitoring its environment and our behavior within it, becoming an active agent in the organization of everyday life in urban space. So, end of quote. This entails a shift in conceptualizing the city as an actor with perhaps more or less human-like qualities. And in the quote, there's also this term publicness, public space. What happens to public space under the influence of all these developments? Now, this is one of the main overarching questions that we'll be dealing with this evening. Just to get a sense of you, the crowd, the audience, and also perhaps respond to it semi-intelligently, I would like to see hands if you are students or working in the profession of architecture and urban planning. Wow, that's a large majority here. Who of you is a designer, say a product designer or 2D web designer, anything? No one. Who of you works in the field of new media? In the broadest possible sense of the word. 2, 3, 4, 5. All right. And who of you is working, for instance, in academia as a researcher? Okay. Thank you. So, well, since we have a good crowd of architects here, I think it's interesting to point out that one of the main arguments that Mark's been trying to set up with this book is that these developments of sentience are directly affecting what architects and planners do. So the question rises, how can architects and planners deal with these developments? And that's another main issue that we'll be talking about this evening. Now, this idea of sentient city may still seem a little bit abstract to you guys, so I would like to point out 3 possible forms to make it a little bit more concrete of how the sentient city may be recognized. And I'm basing this on a distinction made by Mike Krang and Stephen Graham, which is also quoted in Martijn's article, Martijn's contribution to the book. And the first manifestation could be termed the tendency to optimize the city for consumption of products and services, but also for social networking. So you might think, for instance, of technologies like location-based services, mobile devices that enable you to find the nearest Italian restaurant or your friends nearby, where are they? You can also think about smart billboards that target ads at you that may seem interesting to you, that are matching with your profile. The second manifestation of sentient city could be called sorting the city, whereby technologies enable the surveillance and the control of urban life and also manage who has access to certain services and who is excluded from these services. So good examples, of course, camera surveillance, smart software that recognize people by their faces or by their gait, the way they walk. But you could think of RFID chips that also store our movements in various databases, or basically your mobile phone that probably everyone is carrying around with you. There was a case here in Rotterdam not that long ago where there were some riots at a soccer stadium, Feyenoord. And of course the telecom providers, they have quite a good database of your whereabouts. So the police could get this information, and they actually send out 17,000 SMSs to people, text messages, to people who are in the vicinity of that soccer stadium at a certain hour with the request for help in, trying to catch these hooligans. of course, some stakeholders, predominantly businesses and governments, tout these developments as very desirable, but throughout the book, there have been, most authors are raising quite critical questions and sort of envision this as a dystopian future of what the city might look like. So the third development is sort of a counter-development. And it's a bit harder to label. I'm calling it making the city public. And Martijn will say some more about it. And here the technologies are being used to foster new ways to meet other people, to meet new places, to engage in urban issues, take ownership over those issues, and also, you know, trying to stimulate new forms of publicness. And it's interesting to note that these are often quite playful, artistic projects for the most part. So you can think about flash mobs or urban screens that try to organize people around certain topics, or urban games, location-based urban games that are being played. Now, it's important to emphasize that these three descriptions, optimizing the city, sorting the city, and making the city public, are actually happening now, but also are, you know, being envisioned as future scenarios that voice concerns about how we should think about the future city. So the book can actually be read as an agenda for all those involved with designing the city to critically engage and deal with these developments. As one of the contributors in the book writes, the future still has to be made today. So what do I hope that we get out of this evening? When you go home, I hope that you will perhaps have a better understanding of what's going on in various cities worldwide. And I would also, particularly the architects and the planners, sort of try to challenge you to think about these developments in your profession or your future profession. What will the evening look like? Mark will give a talk of about 25 minutes, then we'll have 5 minutes of Q&A. You guys can raise your hand and pose a question. Then Martijn is also going to give a talk, followed by another 5 minutes of Q&A. Then there's going to be a discussion between Mark and Martijn here on the couch. But I'll be walking around with the mic because I really would like to engage you as audience as well in the discussion. 2 simple rules for this evening. 1, please put your mobile phone on silent. And the second one is, if you have a question, raise your hand. It's somewhat hard for me to see with these lights. And try to speak up as loud as possible, or I will come to you with the microphone and perhaps maybe even rephrase the question. So, without further ado, I would like to invite Mark to get on stage and give his presentation.
Well, first, I'd just like to thank Michael for this really pretty great introduction. Actually, I almost don't need to say very much about the kind of theoretical framework, which I think you, for the exhibition and for the book, which I think you very, in a very optimal and efficient way summarized. So thank you for that. I mean, of course, I also want to thank the International Design Seminar and V2 for putting together this evening and the opportunity to formally launch the book in Europe, not just the Netherlands. So what I thought I'd do, though, this evening is really talk a little bit about how something like this came to be. I'll talk a bit about the book itself and specifically some of the projects represented in the book and the case studies, and in the attempt to provide a kind of ground or framework against which we can try to go a little bit deeper into this discussion about the public. I should say that the project initially began with a symposium in 2006. This was a symposium titled Architecture and Situated Technologies at the Urban Center in New York, also organized by the Architectural League of New York. The Architectural League, for those of you who don't know, is an organization, an old organization, actually celebrating its 125th year anniversary when we did the symposium. They decided that there was a desire to find a way to let architecture sort of, or to bring architecture beyond itself, beyond the kind of disciplinary and professional frameworks which existed at the time in terms of what architecture was and what architects did. And so they commissioned a series of projects which were basically, and this was even, I'm not talking about the exhibit here, leading up to the symposium, which were to respond to a call which was looking for architecture and ... right? So what other disciplines, what other fields, what other concerns did architecture need to engage with to bring it beyond itself from at the close of the 20th century into the 21st century? So the Architecture and Situated Technologies Symposium brought together artists, architects, and others to begin to explore this question of situated technologies and how technologies which weren't any place, anywhere, which weren't the kind of blue sky version of the internet, let's say, that we had in the late 90s, but were actually culturally situated, were specific to a particular context, right? And whether it was the context of their use, or whether it was the context of their deployment. Situated technologies were a way for us to begin to think about a different way of thinking about technology, which wasn't this kind of virtual space that was so dominant in at least the profession in the late 90s, but was something which was able to understand this kind of hybrid condition between, on the one hand, sort of a networked, distributed electronic space, on the other hand, a kind of physical, haptic space, the space of everyday life, so to speak. So out of this symposium, and I guess as all good symposiums do, we had more questions than we had answers. And from this, we then developed a series of pamphlet-length publications, which we continue to publish, titled the Situated Technologies Pamphlet Series. Now, this was, again, a project which, the pamphlets are published via print-on-demand technology. They're free. You can go to the Situated Technologies website and download the PDFs. But they were also published by the Architectural League of New York, whatever publishing means in the context of print-on-demand publications. So we got about 3/4 of the way through, and Rosalie Ginevro, the executive director of the Architectural League, whose patience is extraordinary, still trying to wrap their heads around, what was essentially still at the time, 2006, 2007, 2008, a fairly theoretical discussion, right? Which is to say that there weren't very many concrete examples of what we were talking about. And it tended to refer to some examples which existed in other contexts, but nothing which was explicitly addressing this question of situated technologies. So out of this came the idea that we were going to create an exhibition. And this exhibition was going to be one which didn't bring together existing work, but was actually involved in commissioning new work. And I think this was really the kind of foresight that an organization like the Architectural League had at that moment, which is to say that as an institution, as an organization, their role at that moment in time was not to curate an exhibition and bring together work that existed, but to actually provide concrete examples around which we can organize a debate. And that debate, public debate, would be one which would attempt to address the intersection of ubiquitous computing, architecture, in the context of tomorrow's cities. Now, it should be said that this in a way, existed in parallel or alongside a discussion which we're probably familiar with around this idea of the smart city, right? Is there anyone in the room who has not heard of this term smart city? No, of course not. IBM just invested $250 million in an advertising campaign, right? So we all know the smart city. Whether it's IBM, you can insert Sapient or any of these large technology players, right? And this is part and parcel of the problem, right? The idea about introducing this notion of the sentient city was one to try to look for alternate trajectories for technological development and begin to interrogate why isn't it that architects, urban designers, planners are more engaged in imagining, like I like to say, occupying the imaginary of this near future city. So the exhibition consisted of 5 projects which were commissioned through a open call for proposals. This open call received 152 proposals from around the world, which from 22 different countries. And from that, a selection panel of 9 people chose 5 different projects which were in some way trying to map out different trajectories for thinking about the integration of ubiquitous computing in urban contexts. Now, one of the things I should say, we've got this collage here, which is maybe not so well represented in this image, but a conscious reference for us was Living City, which was an exhibition organized by Archigram in 1963 at the Institute for Contemporary Art in London. And Living City was an attempt to look at the flotsam and jetsam of everyday urban life in the 60s in London, specifically the kind of pop culture, the influence of the more ephemeral conditions of the city at that time, and to try to provoke architecture, to provoke the profession of architecture to begin to embrace something which it looked at as an anathema to the practice of architecture, which was at the time, obviously, fairly concerned, very preoccupied with the formal articulation of space and material. I mean, this is, as we have a group of architects in the room, so, think of Louise Sert, right? Can our city survive? The idea of a kind of rational, optimal, efficient city, which through various programs and agendas could be actuated. Archigram was looking for a way to actually reclaim the vitality of the city, of the contemporary city. So we have things like this is a collage from their Instant City project, Urban Action Tune-Up, the collage, 1969. Ron Heron. So the issue, and one of the things that I think is amazing about this collage is that we're seeing things like sort of large-scale projection screens, these kind of temporary structures which come and take over scaffolding systems, news feeds, and so forth, right? And so we're seeing in the moment in the 60s, there's actually a kind of a predisposition, almost a kind of a premonition of the kind of informational overlay that was to come in the 21st century. One might say that to a certain extent, many of these ideas have been theorized, right, by architects in the 60s, such as Archigram, such as Archazum, and others in this general area. But in fact, the difference being that today, as we reach the 21st century, this technology is actually within our reach, right? It has become small, it has become cheap, it has become accessible, and it's become open to speculation by people who are non-experts, right? Or people who don't necessarily work for a large research and development corporate lab funded by IBM. So again, as I think was so eloquently introduced in the introduction, the idea with the exhibition was really to try to find ways beyond just this desire to consume, right, or to control, right? What other strategies exist for the development of the sentient city? So I'm going to just talk a bit about each of the case studies that we commissioned as a prelude to a kind of larger discussion about this question of public and publicness. The first project I'll discuss is amphibious architecture. This is by a collaboration between David Benjamin and Suyin Yang of The Living, and Natalie Jeremijenko of the X-Design Environmental Health Clinic. And the project looks, here we go, this is a good place to start. This is the East River in New York. You're looking at the Williamsburg Bridge, the Manhattan Bridge, and the Brooklyn Bridge in the distance. And what they propose is a series, basically an interface to water quality and the environments beneath this kind of reflective surface that so often in cities is understood as a mirror, as something which exists to reflect the city above it, right? So the project on one level looks at how do we begin to think of architecture itself as an interface, as this surface of water itself becoming another facade of the city in a sense. What one has is a series of tubes which are floating within the water. At the base of these tubes there are sensors which are picking up the presence of fish, but also monitoring the water quality. So the project literally submerges the sentient city underwater, right? Asks us to extend not only where we define the boundaries of what constitutes the city, right? The city is not just buildings, right? Streets, sidewalks, infrastructures like subways and whatnot, but it's also the natural environment, the kind of natural systems that physical city interfaces with. And in this case, enables us through using something as simple as a mobile phone to text message these fish and actually begin to engage the fish as a constituent element of the city, almost as a citizen of the city. So the project proceeds by one, you encounter these buoys floating out in the East River from the sidewalk, right? And this is the FDR Drive. This is the east side of Lower Manhattan. And then through an interface via the mobile phone, can actually access real-time information about the water quality beneath that surface, right? But also identify the number and types of fish there, right? Now, obviously, this is a conceit, right? The idea that the one is actually interacting or interfacing with the fish in the water, but it raises the questions that in the 21st century city, what counts as a citizen, right? And what counts as the city? Where do we understand the boundaries of that city and the ways we can interact with it? The next project is a project by Hack Design and Research, Usman Hack, and it's called Natural Fuse. And I'll just read briefly from the introduction here. Natural Fuse is a micro-scale carbon dioxide overload protection framework that works locally and globally, harnessing the carbon sinking capacities of plants. Basically, what Natural Fuse is electronic circuit breakers. These plants here are connected to the internet, and through a network of friends that you've established, you all create this shared carbon sink, this resource, which enables you to, in a sense, use electricity. There's a LED lamp connected to this. And as long as everyone is collaborating and sort of being conscious of how much energy is being used, right, the plants survive, right? They're watered automatically. But the moment when one sort of exceeds a certain level of consumption of electricity, the network itself starts to kill the plants, right? So in this ultimately what happens is the plant has 3 lives. You get an email first from the offender, right, which is automatically sent to you, and it says, well, so-and-so has been using and a sort of extraordinary amount of electricity, and so therefore your plant has been designated as the circuit breaker in the system, and the plant is killed, right? So the project really looks at this question of shared resources, right? Shared, in this case, energy, and tries to make palpable the idea that this is a kind of collective problem as opposed to an individual problem, right? So based on this kind of more horizontal notion of the commons, where this notion of a kind of social coercion becomes significant, becomes important, right, in the way that we collectively manage these resources, not from an individual standpoint. All right, this is probably my favorite interface on this project. I don't know if you can see it. This is a little knob here, and it doesn't show up so well in the video, but I can read it. This is an off position. This position that is selfless, and then this is your selfish position, right? So you decide, but you decide, but individually, but you have a kind of collective implication which is derived from it. Series of studies which they, over the course of a year, I should mention that each of these projects had a year from the moment when they were commissioned to the moment that the exhibition opened. And the book presents the research that transpired in this course of time. So you have images of the different plants that they were studying, trying to identify what would be the most efficient way to kill them. In what ways can they also potentially be regenerated? That actually never ended up working out. And finally, the decision on which plant would be optimal for this condition. Okay. The next project, Urban Digestive Systems, Trash Track. This is by the Sensible City Lab at MIT. And Trash Track addresses this condition of waste, the removal chain from cities, right? We know quite a lot about how things get to us in cities, the supply chain of cities. But ironically, we actually don't know that much about the digestive systems, right? Where stuff goes once we're done with it. And so Trash Track asks a very simple question, which is to say, what happens when your trash is no longer out of sight, out of mind? And what they do is they take these smart tags and attach them to articles of trash to begin to try to find out where these things go once they're discarded. So for example, we have a coffee cup, which maybe our relationship lasts 5 minutes, 10 minutes. And this coffee cup then is discarded and it's out of sight, out of mind. Their question is, once you embed these objects with at least some ability to report back, right, to give them an authority of a voice, in a sense, of where they've gone, how does this change the way we think about articles of trash, right? How does it change the way we think about our relationship to that coffee cup? To what extent is it something that potentially we reuse, for example? And so the project developed these 3,000 of these tags in partnership with Cisco Systems and Waste Management, which is a large waste removal company in the US. Actually, it's a transnational company. And literally began to map the end-of-life experience of things like a cardboard box, plastic cones. There was an old sneaker which was tagged. Where did the sneaker make it to? Ultimately Oregon, Arlington, Oregon. And so 3,000 of these pieces of trash have been tracked, and it's an ongoing project. They produced this in Seattle. There was a smaller deployment in New York City, and then in London as well. The project continues to go on, but primarily a data visualization project. But in this context, trying to visualize again, what is the digestive chain of a city look like, right? What does that system look like? Yeah, too smart city. What happens when the city is actually not just a smart city, but it's a too smart city? The city is too smart. And if we take, in this context, the simple question of street furniture, park benches, trash cans, street signs, what are the design criteria we need when they start to become behaving artifacts, when they start to have behaviors, when they start to have characteristics? When, for example, in this case, let's take the trash can, which we can see a little bit here. What happens when the trash can actually has a preference for the type of trash it will consume, and it spits back things which don't meet its criteria, right? What is that interaction like, right? What are the design criteria we need for public agencies, right? Municipal agencies which are developing these artifacts. Here's the too smart bench, which, if one is sitting on the bench for longer than 15 minutes, actually ejects you from the bench, right? Or this street, the too smart sign, which literally follows you as you're moving around the space, continuing to sort of bark these different orders at you. And once it attracts your attention, sort of moves into a more steady state where you're transfixed in relationship to a series of no's and detours and so forth. But again, in a kind of whimsical way, the project begins to ask, okay, if we're going to have something as simple as a smart bench or a smart trash can, what is that interaction like, right? What is the behavior? What are the characteristics? And most importantly, how do we think about, what are the design criteria by which we can say, this is well designed, this is not well designed? Finally then, we can, here's Julian Peik, yes. So I don't know what's going on with this tree, but they did, again, their research was really looking into these existing elements in the city. Did a whole series of Lego prototyping, and then what they call Wizard of Oz testing, where you literally, this is the no-tech version, and you have your little mock-up of the trash can, and here's, I guess, the wizard behind there. Again, beginning to look at, the question is, how do you begin to sort of study some of these interactions? Okay. Finally, Breakout, Escape from the Office. Breakout looks explicitly at this question of public space and asks the question, what happens if the entire city is your office? Whether that's a good idea or not, maybe we can discuss, but the project looked at what different kinds of ways can we think about this phenomena of co-working, which literally is the process where people are sharing office space, desk space in a very informal office setting. And using this model is something to reinvigorate public spaces of the city, which are used for other conditions. So the project combines things like social softwares, such as a kind of meetup interface, which enables people to organize in an ad hoc way based around a series of interests, right? On top of that, they then propose a series of infrastructures, adaptable furniture, collapsible structures, and so forth, together with a set of mobile technologies, such as a kind of portable Wi-Fi network, and so forth, which begins to ask what happens when we can think about the way to design cities or to shape the experience of public space in cities, not just through material means, but also through the actions, right? Sort of programming and coordinating actions and different ways of occupying the city. And and how do those modes of occupancy recontextualize the city itself? So where does the city begin? Where does the office end? Where does the office end, and then where does the city begin? Those are the projects. In addition to the projects, there are a series of essays which we attempted to somehow frame a set of, I wouldn't say polemical, but at least in a somewhat didactic way, some of the issues which are at play here. And again, this is not an attempt to sort of narrate a kind of unified condition, but again, to try to find a way to organize a debate about, in the present, about what kind of future we might want. So in other words, if we understand architecture perhaps not as a formal investigation, but as a question of spatial intelligence, right? The framework shifts in the sense that what we do and what we might do as architects changes. What new sites of practice, what working methods might we find might become appropriate. And I think to the extent if we think about it as spatial intelligence, then spatial intelligence for whom, right? Are we talking about the spatial intelligence just of humans? Or are we talking about other forms of what can we learn from the way, for example, monkeys or birds, right, organize their space? And I'm not going to go through and talk about each of these essays, I think, because what we're going to try to do is shift the debate here to one which is really speaking more about the question of the public. And it's right at this moment where I think I'm going to sort of stop my introduction, and we're going to maybe, I guess, sort of open this up to short questions, but to shift and to just for the moment hold on to this idea of the public, right? Where if each of these projects, whether we're dealing with a kind of horizontally distributed notion of the commons, as in natural fuse, or if we're looking at interface to public waterways as actually a site of practice for architecture, or if we're understanding the things like public street furniture as a public, if we're entering, and this is a question, if we're entering a condition where public space is no longer the geography of the public sphere, which is to say that the notion of the public or perhaps more correctly, or more precisely, the publics, where public opinion is formed, is no longer specifically a physical condition. It's no longer wholly resident in the physical city. Then how do we begin to address these new forms of publics in public space? And I think Martijn is going to go into a little bit more depth along those issues. But I'll leave it there, and maybe we can try to have a few questions at this point. Yeah?
All right. Thank you very much.
Yeah, right, yeah.
Great talk. Thank you. I'll go directly to you guys. Is there anyone with a question or a remark after having heard and seen all this? I think there will be someone with a mic in the audience, right? So just raise your hand. Two people, one over here and one there. Raise your hand if you have any questions or anything to say. Does this feel, as you guys, as architects, does this feel like a threat or a new possibility if Mark is saying that publicness or the public is no longer exclusively confined to like the physical environment? How does that feel to you?
It's not a big deal. I mean, it's normal.
Can you elaborate on that? Normal?
Yeah, it's not a surprise, and I feel good with it. I feel comfortable, and totally.
Okay, oh, that's good. I have a question here. I'll go to you with the mic.
Yeah, me? Okay. No, I was actually like to comment upon what he said. Like, is it normal? Because when public or private depends on the physical environment, you can usually control that. Like, you can put more clothes on you, for example. You can put makeup. You can close the doors. But when it actually comes to, I don't know, the virtual environment, for example, I know from experience that Facebook is really hard to control. Like, it doesn't make things easy for you. It doesn't make it that obvious, like what's public and what's not. So I think that can be seen as a threat. Like, how much can you show in terms of virtual reality and in terms of what's public on your profile and on your virtual life?
All right. Well, if you hear that people are talking about this in terms of perhaps threat, is that something you feel they are right in, or do you see it more as a kind of a new opportunity for architects and planners?
I mean, I think, your comment really raises the issue of, how do we become sensitized to these new boundaries of where the sort of personal or intimate private ends and the more public, more open, let's say, or more shared aspects of our lives are present, right? So how do we begin to become aware of how this works? I mean, obviously, everyone, I mean, maybe what's normal about this? Well, it's very normal to be on a street or a sidewalk or in a public space today and somebody's speaking on a mobile phone and we're hearing the intimate details of somebody's relationship breaking down or, somebody's lawsuit that they're currently in or, some business deal that somebody's trying to sell. And it's incredible the specificity of the detail which one is able to glean from these types of strange transgressions between things which maybe more traditionally were private and not conversations not carried out in the public domain. But if we think about things like Facebook, then right, which to a certain extent is really the production of a public persona. And one which the kind of privacy conditions are constantly being drawn and redrawn by the policies by Facebook itself, right? This is a concern that many people have, where you have people who are stories of people being denied jobs because somehow they've looked at their Facebook profile and there's that photo of you at that party without your shirt or drinking or right. The question becomes, what happens when that model, somehow merges with the physical environment, We're beginning to see ways that it's doing that, right? With these kind of places where you can check into a place in a physical location and it appears as a status message on your Facebook profile. So, I mean, to me, it's not really a question of, is one right or not about this, but it's a question of kind of raising a sort of, becoming a little bit more inquisitive as to in what ways we're being asked to share things about ourselves in ways that we're not necessarily familiar with, the degree to which that becomes more publicly accessible. I mean, the other side of it has to do with this question of inference, right? Which is to say that there was a couple of different projects at MIT actually going on, and I write about this in the introduction a bit, but ones which can mine your profile data, publicly accessible profile data in terms of, say, the sexual orientation of your friends, right? And by a statistical analysis can actually, predict with some level of accuracy your, the potential, your sexual orientation, right? So, information which is deemed private in one context actually becomes public in another through inference engines, right? What happens when this is mapped to your mobility patterns in cities, right? I think in Rotterdam about a year ago, the chip card system was put in place. Does anybody know?
A bit longer.
A bit longer, right? Yeah, maybe, yeah, because we were talking about this in the IABR. And so the question becomes when your mobility patterns, it's one thing to sort of provide a kind of easier access through a turnstile when you're getting into the subway, but it's another thing when this information is one, stored, right, then aggregated, and we know that, for instance, Martijn is late today for work or where he's going, or somebody else is going to a part of the city which they don't usually go to, and we actually know somebody else who's in that neighborhood. And what's going on with that, right? The question becomes, when this stuff gets mapped to physical space, there are certain inferences about what's happening in that space, which is different, and gets made public in ways we're not necessarily aware of. Whether that's normal and whether we care about it is a kind of, that's the kind of discussion I think we need to have, right? Doesn't matter. Some people will say, in terms of, oh, I don't care what people know about me on Facebook. I put it up there because I want everyone to know, right? But the question is, what things can be inferred from that, right? And what are you revealing through ways and methods that you're not even aware of? Right?
Thanks. Anyone else who has a question for the moment? Then I would like to thank Mark again. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Of course, we'll have Mark back here sitting on the couch later, but first I would like to give the floor to Martijn, who will give a presentation about, this notion of publicness specifically.
Yeah, thank you. Before I start, just to follow up on what Mark said, because I think that you up here, I think you raised an important point about what's happening with all the data that's being assembled, not only on an individual level, but even on an aggregate level. I think 1 or 2 weeks ago here in the Netherlands we had a bit of a scandal in the media because the national company TomTom, which is a maker of navigation software, they aggregated all the traffic information of people. So where are people driving very fast and where are they driving very slow? And everybody who uses this navigation system is actually actively contributing to this aggregate database. And it can be really interesting because it can help you to avoid maybe a traffic jam. But what they did this time, they sold the aggregated data to the police. So the police could see on which parts of the highways people were usually driving very fast, and that's where they started to insert the new checkpoints, so they could find the people. So all these kinds of things are actually happening right now. But in my presentation, I will actually be or approach this subject from a more optimist, or maybe you could even say a naive position. The question that I want to ask today is what kind of new public spheres, urban public sphere, is emerging with the rise of this sentient technology. And if we talk about urban public sphere, of course, immediately places like this come to mind. I don't know, how many of you know this place? Few hands, yeah. Who here is from Rotterdam? So the majority is not from here, but I guess you've been taking a tour of the city today. This is, of course, the central square, the Schouwburg Square. It's, you know, public space in the center of the city. Or another thing that immediately comes to mind when we talk about urban public sphere are spaces like this. This is the Unie in Rotterdam also. It's a building where usually lots of debates are being held. So this is the idea of the public sphere where we all go to and we have deliberate debates and we try to come to a consensus and make decisions about the future of the city. So these are, I would say, I guess, the two typologies of public space. The urban public sphere, and they have been here for centuries. You know, they're the Agora and the Acropolis, places where we go for debate, and places where we go to hang out, to meet, to trade, to show who we are, etc. So what's happening with the sentient technology is the fact that the city is no longer, and Mark and Michiel already pointed this out, it's no longer just a physical city anymore, but it is actually enhanced by all this technology around us, and usually we use these somewhat mysterious acronyms. I don't know if you know all of them, but it's not really that important. What's more important is actually what they do. And this is also just a very brief summary. Sentient technologies, they are the technologies that are everywhere in the city, and you know, they sense what's going on, they aggregate the data, they can operate and actuate on it, and they can even learn and anticipate on what might happen and already change the environment to that. So that's actually happening to our urban public spaces right now. What does that mean then? I'm going to briefly look at 3 examples. And for those of you who are not from Rotterdam, maybe you've already noted that I use the background of my slides to give you some examples of public space, physical public space, actually in Rotterdam. But let's have a look at 3 examples of how this sentient technology is changing our idea of the urban public sphere. The first one is coming from Denmark, and it's a project, it's called Climate on the Wall. And it was done in Aarhus by the Digital Urban Living Lab. And I'll show you a brief film clip of what's actually happening. It's a project in the center of Aarhus during a theme week on the environment. And what they actually try to do is they try to stage a public discussion in the urban public sphere by using an urban screen or media facade type of technology. And the concept is based on magnetic poetry. I don't know if you know this. You know, you have all the little words and you put them on your fridge and you can shift the words around and, you know, some sort of Dadaist poem will emerge. And they use that same thing here. You see on the bottom all the words. They're just going around there. And if you walk past it, like the guy just did, one of the words, you know, they will become bigger and they will be turned into a balloon. And then you can drag one of the balloons and you can put them somewhere in a space, in the sentence that's emerging on top. It's Danish. My Danish is not so good, so I'm not sure what actually is appearing there. But the idea of this project was, okay, the urban public sphere is, you know, a place where we go and we have discussions, so we're going to reenact this with sentient technology. The technology that observes you, sees what you do, and you can interact with it, and you can actually have discussion there. Did it happen? Not really. Of course, what always happens if you put something up in public space is that people are going to make jokes. So they're not going to put a serious discussion there, but they're going to, you know, make some funny sexist joke or something on the wall with the words are there. But what did happen is that discussions sort of started not on the wall, but the people who were watching the wall in the urban public space. So it was not so much the conversation itself that was interesting. The piece acted almost as a conversation piece. You know, it sparked discussion among people elsewhere. So this is, you know, an example of where you can use sentient technology to sort of reenact something that we already had, you know, an agora, public discussion in public space. The second one sort of falls in the same category. It's also a way where this new technology is used to to make public space more interesting. And it's a flash mob that's happened here in the Schouwburgplein, I think about a year ago. International Pillow Fight Day. Who wasn't a part of it? People showed up and started to have pillow fights. And what's interesting about it is also is that about half of the people here are, of course, having the pillow fight. The other half of the people is filming it with their smartphones. So it's not only there on the screen, but the actual event maybe happens on YouTube afterwards when everybody uploads the little films. And of course, this is a very trivial example of what you can do with mobile technology and social networks to organize an event in public sphere. But I think what we've seen in countries like Egypt and Libya is how this technology actually can be used to claim the public sphere in a certain way and organize and etc. So it's not as trivial as this might look. Both examples are, of course, still based on this old typology of, the public sphere is bringing people physically together and having a discussion or showing who you are or claiming your rights. And the third example is this one that Mark just showed, the trash track example from the Sensible City Lab. And I think that this is a very interesting example of what the urban public sphere might look like in the future. Mark already explained the project, that you follow the trash of people and it's being mapped, and you can follow your own trash or watch the trash of other people. And why do I think this is interesting? Why do I think that this is maybe a way of organizing the urban public sphere of the future? Because probably the first question that you're asking is, how is this urban? I mean, okay, of course there is a map and it's about things that are happening in the city, but how is this an urban public sphere? So I will elaborate a bit on that. Some notes on the urban public sphere. What is this urban public sphere? What does it do? And here's a quote. I'm sure you're all familiar with it, as most of you are architects, from Jane Jacobs. And she wasn't the first one who observed this, but I think she's one who put it most beautiful. She says, great cities are not like towns, only larger. They are not like suburbs, only denser. They differ from towns and suburbs in basic ways. And one of these is that cities are by definition full of strangers. Of course, I'm not telling you anything new. It's even so obvious that we usually don't notice it anymore. That the basic condition in the city is that we're dealing with all these people that we don't know, and not even do we not know them. Most of them are also very different from us. They have maybe different identity, different political opinion, different goals in life. Yet at the same time, we have to relate to them. We live together in the city, we have to decide about the future of the city, we have to deal with them in our everyday lives. And many of the theories of urban public space, they say that dealing with the stranger, that's what urban public space is doing. There are all these mechanisms that make urban public spaces work, and because of those spaces, we can actually live together with these strangers. I'm taking this quote from Frey and Beulen, from one of the pamphlets that Mark has been editing, and they're summarizing what Hannah Arendt has said about the public sphere, because she elaborates on that. She says, the public sphere is the site of collective performance. It brings together those who are different from one another precisely because they are different. So the public sphere is a place where we meet all those people that are different and with whom we have to relate in either discussions or through all sides of performance. And she says, the collective that acts in the public realm is not a uniform entity such as a class, a nation, or a mass. What brings people together is what separates them from each other. So we have all these mechanisms in the public space. And of course, we cannot go into too much depth right now, maybe later in the discussion. I mean, Jane Jacobs has a different vision on what actually happens in urban public space than Hannah Arendt or Sennett. But all of them describe the mechanisms of this public space as actually spaces that bring different people together, and then some sort of magic happens. And what the magic exactly is, we'll leave out of this discussion right now. But of course, that's a very interesting discussion in itself. So what the public space is, it's places in the city that because of the way they are designed or their function or the place that they have in the bigger geography, they are places that bring different people together. And so far, in architecture, these places have been very physical. And interventions that architects and designers have been doing is mainly trying to bring people physically together in a different way. To look for social seams, as Jane Jacobs has said, or to look for weak borders, as Richard Sennett has said. I remember, just to give you an example that Richard Sennett once gave. He was involved in the designing of a market for the Spanish people in East Harlem. And at the time, they thought, okay, we're going to put this market right in the middle of their district, because then it's the center of their district and they can feel proud that they have a beautiful market. And then 10 or 15 years later, he was revising that project and he said, actually, that was a bad decision to put it in the center of this district. What we should have done is we should have put it right at the border of their district. Because if it's right at the border, then the people from the east, the Spanish people will come there, but maybe we'll also draw in the people from the area right below it. So in that way it becomes a weak border, as he calls it. It's a design intervention to bring those different groups of people that live in different parts of the city to bring them together. So mainly these interventions have been physical, right? It's the design of places, make them attractive, etc. Although it's not quite true. If we look at Habermas, who is one of the first, who is an important philosopher of the public sphere, he published a book in the, I think it was the 60s, on the urban public sphere, and he looks at the emergence of the urban public sphere in our modern days. And he sees that public sphere emerging in the coffee houses in 17th century England. And he describes how in these coffee houses, people are starting to come together and talk about issues of a common concern. It's something new that then is happening under particular historical conditions. And he says that's the birth of a modern public sphere right there. But it's not only the place that people, where people are coming together to have a coffee and discuss things. A very important part in that place, or in those discussions, is actually the newspaper. What happened in those coffee houses is that people would read from the newspaper, and then they would discuss what they had read in the newspaper, and then somebody would write a letter to the newspaper to summarize the discussion or to bring in an alternative point of view. And one of the major newspapers actually had a letterbox right next to one of the major coffee houses, so it would be very easy for people to mail news to the newspapers. So what was happening there was actually the emerging of all these little public spaces, coffee houses, different sites in London, all drawing their own publics, but they were being united in some sort of a public sphere. The discussions were being threaded by the newspaper, where bits of the discussion would come together and then go down to one of the coffee houses and go back. So we're talking about physical urban public sphere, but media have, from the beginning on, had some point of way of mediating between those public sphere and playing an important role in that. So, having said all that, the question that I'm looking at is, how can we use these infrastructures that sense, that aggregate, that operate and actuate, that learn and anticipate, how can they be appropriated to organize publics? If we can no longer organize publics physically, or maybe we can still do that as well, but maybe these technologies give us another way to organize publics. And Frey and Beulen, in the Situated Technologies pamphlet, they say that we should no longer try to really assemble publics just in physical places, but we should try to organize publics around shared issues of concern. And we can use new media infrastructures to do that. So maybe these new media structures in some way or another can play the part that the newspaper did in the 7th century coffee house. And that's when I'm coming back to a trash track, because in a way, trash track is doing that. It's using the Internet of Things by tracking the trash that's being thrown away at all these places to map, to put a shared issue of concern literally on the map. It's showing us how trash moves and makes us aware of what's happening to the trash. And of course, the hope that people from this project have is that awareness of what's happening, might eventually lead to a change in behavior or discussions about it. It's also interesting to note that this project was done together with the library in Seattle, because the library says that our goal in society is also to organize the public sphere and bring out all the information that we have so that discussions can be held. Now that's an interesting thought, but it's also very challenging, because I guess the main question for designers, maybe people even like you, that if you're interested in things like this, is how do you move from just representation, from just a map, that's a beautiful image, how do you move towards a sense of ownership? How do you go from just tracking stuff and putting it on a map to actually organizing that public around that issue? I mean, it's a step that not automatically follows, and we're seeing a lot of that actually right now. We're seeing, I think, tens or maybe hundreds of projects like these everywhere in musea and art houses all over the world, and they're very beautiful projects. This is Lisbon, or actually it's a map of the traffic in Lisbon, the aggregation of the traffic in a very beautiful visualization done by Pedro Miguel Cruz. But really, what does it do beyond just being a beautiful map? How does a representation of what's happening, how can you organize a public around that? How to move from mapping to interface. Interface is a term that Natalie Jeremenko and Benjamin Breton use to describe a system that's not merely a representation, but that allows you as a user to actually act upon it. And I guess in the remaining minutes, I'll give a few projects that are starting to do that in a way. Although I must say that we haven't seen many very successful examples, but we're also in the beginning of this emerging Internet of Things and appropriations in other ways than the smart city, as Mark has pointed out. This is a project, it's called Bike-tastic. It's done in Los Angeles by the Urban, I have to look it up, Urban Sensing Lab at UCLA. And they're also using actually tracking technology, the iPhone, to track people who are moving through the city. But this time it's bikers. So everybody who wants to join downloads an app on their iPhone, and when you start biking through the city, it registers, of course, your speed, how often you stop, but it also registers the noise around you and the altitude, so if you go up hills or not. And the idea or the goal is that eventually, when many people start doing this, a biking map of LA will appear. You can see, which are the beautiful biking paths because there is no noise and there's not that much traffic lights, and which are the very, the harsh ones where cars are really almost running you down all the time and where you have to wait for the stoplights all the time. And the goal is, of course, that a map like that and a project like that will actually invite people to, maybe not drive but start biking, or to make the experience of biking better, or etc. So it's already a start. I mean, it's making the information at least useful on a personal basis and intervening in the dialogue about pollution and traffic, etc. in a city like Los Angeles. Does it really do the interfacing thing? I'm not sure. It's a start. Of course, projects like this, like you mentioned, there's always this question of, how much data do you want to give away of yourself, and how is it going to use? So that's a whole other discussion that really should be held. I'm going to look at one other project. It's called in the air, and it's done by the Media Lab, Prado in Madrid. And it's also a project, more a thinking exercise than an actual project. This is a project that's mapping the environmental pollution in Madrid. I think on the slide, if you look very good, well, you can't really see it, but what's the blurry beige, that's actually a picture of Madrid, and on top you see the polygons, and that's the level of pollution that's being mapped real time. And what I like about this project is it's not just this visualization, but there's also some tools around it that they have made. For example, they made an iPhone app, or I'm not even sure if they actually made it, but they are prototyping it, which is a pollution compass. So you have put the app, and you can see how dirty the air is, and then the compass tells you in which direction you have to walk if you want to have cleaner air. And they also have a travel or a navigation guide connected to it. So you say where you want to go, and then it tells you, okay, you're here in the city. If you want to go there, then you can either go by subway, you can go by bike, or you can go by car. And if you go by car or by subway or by bike, this is the amount of pollution that you contribute to what you're actually seeing there. So it's making this cloud of pollution not a big abstract thing, but it also tells you what actually your contribution is to it and what you can do to maybe make it better. And what I really liked about the project also is that, because so far these projects that we've been discussing, they're all still virtual, but this is a project they're also trying to bring it actually back in the physical urban public sphere. This is, at the project itself, what they did was they made a big fountain somewhere in Madrid, and they colored it, so the water would be different colors and different heights according to the pollution levels. But they're also prototyping this set of little lights that everyone in the city can put on their balcony, and it will show the aggregation of the levels of pollution in the city, or maybe you can play with it so you can show your own contribution, or it could be, tuned to a system somewhat similar to the one from Usman Haq that Mark was describing, but to actually trying to bring these visualizations also again back into the physical city. So I guess that sort of rounds it up. What I really would try to tell is, how can we use these emerging sentient technologies? How can we use those to organize publics rather than just organize publics physically in the city? And the issues are, of course, how can we do that and provide the public that we want to assemble first with a sense of ownership, so that they have an idea, okay, this concerns me, I'm involved, and also provide them a way to act. Okay, this is something that I can maybe do about this issue, or this is how I can be part of maybe the discussion, or etc., etc. And maybe a fourth point extra is, another interesting design question is, can we then also bring this back into the urban public sphere, the physical one? Okay, that was what I was having to say. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Martijn, thank you very much. Is there anyone in the audience who has an immediate question for Martijn? Because I do have some questions, but I would first like to ask you, to give you the chance to perhaps voice an issue. Yes.
Yeah, okay, thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting. I think in some projects, if I understood right, you were asking how the space or the designed space could create a public sphere. And I think publicity is created by social action. So if social behaviors are created by people, and if you are thinking how the space now could create this kind of space, then you are thinking, in my opinion, somehow how to manipulate the people in a positive way, okay? But if you are, I think if you are architect and you're protecting project designing, thank you, designing a space, I think you're more or less thinking on a functional way. And if you now put a question how to make a functional project or design with social behaviors, I think this is the wrong way of asking. You should look from the social behavior point of view and then looking from this to the space. And if we could use or should we use.
I think if I understood your question right, is saying, you know, public sphere is, it comes into being by action, by people who start doing things. And as architects, we should not be involved in bringing people together or steering that process. Is that what you're trying to say?
Sorry, I was concentrating on the microphone. Can you please repeat?
As I understood your question, you're saying, okay, public sphere comes into being when publics organize, but publics should do that themselves, and the architects shouldn't intervene in that process.
No, I think public is created just by people coming together. So public is not, here's an open space, and if people are inside, it's public. No, public is created by social action. It doesn't matter how the space is open or not.
No, I think partially you're right, but I think that in design, you can try to, if you want, you can try to encourage the process. I'll give you an example. This was a story I heard about a campus, a college campus that was being designed, I think somewhere in California. And what the architect did was he organized the walking path to all the buildings on the campus in such a way that all the path would come through the public square in the center of the campus. So just by doing that, he wanted to create an opportunity where people, he wanted to create a place of friction, so where people would meet. I mean, anything could happen in that place, but he wanted at least, I mean, he could organize the city in such a way that people would, you know, become aware of themselves. And I guess, I mean, it's the same with Jane Jacobs is, you know, if we take her ideology, she's saying that, okay, if you want to have a public sphere in a city, what you should do is you should have, this was of course the walking city of New York in the 60s, you should have short blocks and you should have a grid, because then you maximize the numbers, maximize the number of ways that people can potentially meet and interact with each other. And if you design a suburb with all cul-de-sacs, then you design, you know, much more private use of those spaces. So I think there are ways that you as a designer, you can think of, you know, how can I design a space, if you wish, to actually promote chances of people, you know, interacting, meeting each other, etc. But of course, that doesn't mean that you should I think you're right, if I understand you right, that you also should leave it open. I mean, you shouldn't say, okay, you know, I'm going to decide, I'm going to design this square, but you can only come here and protest for this particular cause and not for the other cause. I mean, all these technologies should be designed in such a way that they're open and they can be sort of reconfigured by the users as well in a particular way.
Does that answer your question? Perhaps then later we can come back to this in the discussion. Thank you very much for your question and thanks for your answer. Is there anyone else with a question? Yes.
I wanted to ask you, when you're talking about the things you're looking at, it's actually not the individuals, but the communities, so the groups. And then you're looking like, after looking at the groups, or like all the networks between the groups, you can go both ways, like looking at the individuals to make them aware of like all the stuff they're using or like their place in the city maybe, or actually doing like something to develop new processes in the city. But this is still really like abstract, I think, and not really linked to architectural space. So this is something I think, yeah, maybe you can say something about this. Like, I don't see directly the link to space. It's more like the social aspects and like being aware of the processes in the city and interacting with other people, but yeah.
No, I
Like it
think
doesn't say anything about the form or like.
No, I think you're partially right. I guess what I was trying to say is that when we think of public sphere, and I'm just leaving disciplines aside, not so much architecture, but maybe just in a more philosophical way even, a public sphere is a place where everybody comes together. And if it's in an Arendian sense, the public sphere is a place where everybody comes together and is very different from each other. I mean, there's very other interpretations as well. So, I mean, and cities have always produced spaces like that where people would come together, from the Agora and the Boulevard and etc. maybe until now. At the same time, a lot of people are saying that exactly those types of public space, the physical ones, where people are actually physically brought together in a public sense, that they're under threat, because we have commercialization and shopping malls which regulate the use of the space on the one hand. We have privatization where people go into the suburbs and drive their cars into the parking garages, so they're not really even coming in public space anymore. I mean, the criticism, I think partly it's correct, but I think there's still a lot of other physical public spaces that are still there. But the question today is, how can we organize publics in a different way? So not so much by bringing people physically together, but by bringing them together maybe around an issue of concern. And can we do that by using that sentient technology that's being used in the city? The tracking, the aggregating, etc., etc. And then maybe can we also bring some of that, that was in the last example, can we maybe bring some of that then back again into the physical space? But I guess the discussion is really what is the role of the architect as well. I mean, is the architect somebody who is shaping volumes in space, or is an architecting someone who is organizing social processes in space? I mean, there's different ways of looking at what is architecture. And especially if you are looking at the second one, then I don't think you can still talk about architecture as, we're just going to design a square and, whatever people do with their mobile phones or etc. I don't care about it. But partly you're right. I mean, I'm talking about what's happening in the city.
All right, thanks. I would like to sort of turn the question back on you, actually, because if you have been listening to the talks by Mark and by Martijn, have you been triggered in any way to think about how you as an architect might sort of translate this, as you call it, sociological notion of publicness, how you can translate it back into a physical design or physical intervention? Have you been thinking about it during the talk?
Yeah, because we have to design something, but I don't have like a concrete thing. But I really think like I think it's interesting also with this application of walking in the city. Like sometimes people who don't know a city already, they see the city not like a map, but really like as a line, the line they're following, So in this way, maybe it's not really like designing the spaces, but the routes inside the city, or like, I don't know, like.
All right.
Yeah.
It's more of a sort of creating a clear mental map of the city for people
like,
to.
Maybe people are identified with some places, and then they just move in between these places.
All right.
I don't know.
Thanks. There's a question here. Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm sorry. You raised the question before about flexibility. And
Sorry, about?
flexibility of the space. And basically I was meaning to ask, you talked about how people adapt to the space and what the space is actually doing to people, how pollution, for example, can influence people's routes in the city. But I was wondering, like using these technologies, isn't it more useful to actually shape the space according to the activities and the needs? For example, like talking about that campus where he actually designed the routes in the campus so that people would meet. Wouldn't it actually be easier to leave the grass as it is and see where people move and then design the pathways? Like, what's the actual point of architecture when you're influencing things rather than letting things sort of tell you how architecture should be. It's sort of a way of participating.
Mm-hmm.
Is Martijn overestimating the role of the architect in this talk? Is that?
Yeah, that's
sort of
what
the
I'm
point
saying.
of
I
it?
mean, architects usually act as they're dictating what people should do, and in fact, I think you should listen more to the people. And maybe these kinds of technologies could actually do that. Like, the city could be as intelligent as to read what people want to do and then react to it, rather than sort of let people act according to itself to the city.
Mm-hmm.
Good point.
Thank you.
Martijn, would you like to react?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's an interesting point. I mean, the question, I mean, obviously, you cannot leave the whole city open. You know, you cannot make just one big, you cannot design a campus as one big grass, well, maybe you can do it. You know, just one big field of grass and then some buildings in there and then see what happens. Maybe you can do that. But I guess there is always a fine balance that you're trying to find between not influencing some people, but organizing particular structures that work without actually conditioning people. And I think if you translate that back to the design of sentience, for example, an important point is that, I mean, there is a lot of talk about interactive cities or interactive architecture, whereas a lot of that is it's not really interactive, it's responsive. You know, you push a button and then something happens, but it's always the same thing that happens when you push the button. Whereas real interactivity is, you know, where you would also be able to influence actually what you could do, you know, when you push the button. To bring it back to some of the themes of today, there is a lot of discussion, you know, that for instance, all the data in the Sentient City that's being gathered, you know, to who does this data belong? Should it become maybe a big open source data set? I mean, should that be the goal? And then the people can decide for themselves what they want to do with you, you know, just like with your grass field, or should you try to shape it already in a particular way? And I think there is a fine balance. I think on the one hand, it would really be good to have an open source data set, so people can play with all the data in the city. But maybe it would also be interesting to have some sort of, you know, design interfaces on the data already.
All right. Last question, and for us, please remember your question to bring back in the discussion later. Go ahead.
I want to elaborate on your point of letting the people play with the data sets in the city, because I think there's already a lot of data sets that are geo-located in the city. You have people that make bike routes, Runkeeper. You have people that play location-based games in the city. Panoramio, Wikipedia, that is location-based. So actually the data is already there. The only problem is that the old lady that lives there, where all the data is right in front of her house, doesn't see it because she doesn't own a smartphone. But what if you could make all that data visible in front of her house and let her participate in a specific way, and that she suddenly understands that the guy that's walking in front of her house every day with his invisible dog is actually playing a location-based game in front of her house. And that so that you actually reflect all the data that's already there into the city.
Yeah, so what you're saying is that apart from the open data sets, we also need maybe physical interfaces in the city.
Kind of a search machine that gathers or snoops all the information from all the different kind of companies and that actually extracts that data and makes it visible.
In theory, I guess that would be an interesting idea. I think practically, of course, I mean, there is a lot of semantic problems to work out. You know, what is interesting for whom, and who decides that, and is it an algorithm, or, you know, what is the interaction, etc., etc., etc. But I think, in principle, it would be an interesting idea.
All right. I want to close off this short Q&A and invite Mark back on stage. What we are going to do now is to have a discussion between Mark and Martijn, and I'll also raise a couple of questions and sometimes look at you, at the audience, if there's anybody who would like to intervene or, you know, post a remark. Please raise your hand, and hopefully I'll look at you. Now, you just said about the old lady, and I thought that was quite an interesting remark. She doesn't know that there are all these kind of data in the city, right? And that actually brings me to the question that I have for both of you. For instance, Martijn was talking about the project of the Media Lab in Prado, which, you know, it looked quite beautiful, but it was also sort of high-tech imagery, right? So perhaps for some people who are not so media literate in recognizing those images, such depictions of environmental issues would be very hard to read. And maybe in some of the examples that you gave, you could also pose a more critical question: who are you addressing with those projects? Are those the kind of people that are already interested in these topics and that will be engaged by them anyway? Or is there also a way to reach new audiences for these kind of topics around, you know, these critical debates around the sentient city? Maybe Martijn would like to start, and then Mark.
Or maybe you, 'cause I can talk, yeah. I guess currently these projects, they work in different ways. I think, you know, what you've been doing with the exhibition and the book is very important to actually. I mean, obviously, most of those things that are being exhibited over there, they're not made to be, you know, on the shelves of Walmart next year. They are made to do an intervention in a debate. They're made not so much for their practical use, but they're design interventions in the debate. So that's, I guess, that's one level, because what we're seeing right now is that the smart city is being rolled out, and it's being rolled out mainly by you know, companies like Cisco and IBM, like you mentioned, and they're approaching the smart city from a particular point of view that, as you said, mainly is optimizing or personalizing the city, the infrastructure. And I mean, there is not always necessarily something wrong with that, but there is so much more that we can do with this technology. And I think, therefore, it's incredibly important to have these projects and exhibitions and book and events like this to, you know, try to influence the discussion and hopefully in that way, you know, in the end, design interventions will be made in different ways.
So it will trickle down to a wider audience.
And I think most of the projects that you're seeing right now are in that area. But that's also a critique. I mean, there are so many art projects and interventions that are doing something with digital media, for example, to make public space more interesting. But, you know, they last 1 hour, and, you know, maybe 20 of their friends will come, maybe 50 other people, and then it's gone again. You know, it's a problem that, I guess, mainly in the art world, or also some maybe in the circles around that, in the design world, you know, how do you make these projects more sustainable over time? How do you increase their impact? And I don't really know if I have an answer for that.
Mark, what's your take on this?
Well, you know, on one level, it goes back to your, what was your name? You asked the question about form.
Yes, Nicolas.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I think quite often when architects are confronted with these conditions, and, you know, to speak directly to the question, I mean, you know, the first audience for the exhibition and for the book obviously was the profession of architecture itself, and to try to bring to that discourse in architecture a kind of set of tools, conceptual tools by which perhaps the practice could be rethought. Quite often the issue reverts back to, well, you know, what does this have to do with form, right? You know, how do I, you know, I mean, I'm an architect, I design forms in space, right? But I think one of the propositions is that, you know, maybe, and this is something Dan Hill addresses in this idea of spatial intelligence in his chapter. It's something that the amphibious architecture addresses in the idea that architecture potentially can be understood as an interface, that it's perhaps not so much in the kind of disposition of material form that an architect can intervene within these conditions, but can begin to understand questions about spatial organization, how people perceive and interact with and through space, how the example of the paths in the Californian campus set the stage for social interaction. Don't necessarily control it. I mean, I think we want to be very careful to distinguish and differentiate and place perhaps at a distance a kind of behavioralism, which we had in architecture in the 60s and 70s, people like B.F. Skinner, and these kind of idea of a sort of over-determination of what people will do or could do in a space. I mean, at the end of the day, people will be, as, Rem Koolhaas, the prodigal son of Rotterdam in some regards, will say, people will be happy in a space, people will be miserable in a space. The more and more he thinks about it, architecture has nothing to do with it, right? That's one position that's taken. So the question is what role, when we speak to the audience of architecture, what role can architects play in this? And I think so issues about how we, architecture has a long history of thinking about relationships between public and private, right? How do you grade degrees of privacy or degrees of publicity within, through things like walls, visual barriers, audio barriers, things like this, right? So, and architects are very good at that, right? How then can we start to sensitize ourselves as a discipline and as a profession to begin to think about the way these boundaries between public and private are being redrawn, right? In what ways can we, perhaps participate in technology development, but also understanding how simply people are using these technologies is beginning to change this, changes the way we think about doing things like organizing space and material in relationship to these activities. And so I think, in context of that audience, there's a lot to do. But it does require us to think about architecture in an expanded field, right? And that's difficult, right? I mean, so part of the project was to try to open up and provide a kind of bridges between people who work with technology or people who are primarily artists. I mean, what does it mean to text message a fish? What architectural relevance does that have? Well, what it does is it makes us sort of expand what we think, who we design for, right? And so Matthew Fuller's essay in the book addresses this question about different forms of spatial intelligence which have to do with non-human inhabitants of the city, let's say, right? Now it's a preposterous notion, right? And it's intentionally preposterous because part of the intention here is to provoke a discussion, right? And to, enable us to sort of think more broadly about what architecture can be. And Keller Easterling's essay suggests that the action is the form ultimately, and that the locus of and sort of new methods for architecture and sites of practice for architecture may be in thinking about designing actions and interactions and transactions, right? So that's a big stretch. Now, the other side of this, which is the Media Lab Prado example, and is the grandmother example. How does this become relevant for somebody who doesn't have a smartphone? Somebody, this is an opportunity, I think, where architecture can act very directly, right? How do we interface with this? What happens when buildings, when spaces, when street furniture can actually become an interface to this information, where it's not so much about accessing it through a portable device that you carry with you, but it's more about how information data sets can be made ambient, can be accessible, right? So a building potentially becomes an interface to a set of information which is not material, it's immaterial in nature, but the building, whether we're talking about sort of dynamic controls of lighting conditions, or one is talking about this like physical actuation of building surfaces or structures which expand and contract. I mean, they're actually, we know within architecture, there's 20, 30, 40 years of investigation into forms which can respond, right? This notion of responsive architecture is not a new idea. What is potentially new is that...
Isn't that one of the problems then, that like the life cycle of architecture is so much slower than the life cycle of many of these media technologies that we're seeing here today, and that perhaps therefore also architects may have the sense, well, how can I design for something that has such a rapid turnover?
Well, architects design for technologies which have rapid turnovers all the time. I mean, think about telephone systems, think about heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems. You know, it's Rainer Banham 40 years ago, over 40 years ago, wrote this book, The Architecture of the Well-Tempered Environment. Is anybody familiar with Rainer Banham and that book? I mean, you know, a couple of people. Well, what he was doing, he was looking back at the history of how you condition space, right? Through heat, through ventilation, through plumbing even. And typically something which was embedded in, right? You know, I mean, you know, generally speaking, the norm in architecture had been to bury this stuff in places where we couldn't see it. And he literally writes a history of architecture which draws out of the woodwork the ways that space, you know, these systems which, generally speaking, in the profession of architecture are sort of banished to the consultant, the HVAC consultant, right? He's the guy who comes in, or the woman who comes in, you know, at the sort of team meeting and tells you where to put the plumbing, right? Or where to run the HVAC ducts. Well, actually, what happens when that becomes material for architectural speculation? And of course, we see things like, you know, originally Cedric Price and Gordon Pask and Joan Littlewood developed this project called the Fun Palace, where this stuff actually, literally, the guts of the building and its ability to be changed and reconfigured become part and parcel of the architecture, which then was picked up by you know, the Centre Pompidou in Paris, right? Where suddenly these systems themselves are the material of architecture. Again, material systems, right? Which have discrete forms. I mean, you know, the shift or the jump now is to say, what happens when we start to address these immaterial conditions? And I think architects can, you know, basically, you know, we're trained, educated to think about complex choreographies of space, of material, of technologies, of people, of something as banal and prosaic as water. You know, how do we prevent water from coming into a building, right? These are taken and seen from a different light opportunities, I guess. And, you know, Peter Cook starts this, you know, I start my introduction to the book with a reference from Peter Cook, and he says, you know, and this is from the Living City exhibition, and he says, you know, when it's raining in Oxford Street, and, you know, for the Brits, Oxford Street is Main Street, or, you know, this sort of main street in the city, the street, qua street, right? He says, when it's raining in Oxford Street, architecture is no more important than the rain, right? In fact, the weather may have more to do with the pulse of the living city than the architecture itself, right? So how we understand the kind of atmospheric conditions, light, air, heat, you know, cooling, these have as much to do with the way we can experience space as anything else. Philip Rahm is an architect who's done a lot of work with atmospheric architectures.
Allow me to interrupt you. Thanks for these great bunch of examples. What I would like to ask you, did you have any remarks or points that you would like to ask about Martijn's presentation? I would like you to comment back and forth on each other's thoughts.
You're asking me?
Yeah, to pose a question to Martijn.
Well,
if you have one.
I wonder what we can. I mean, let's talk about the relationship. You know, when we say public space, it's, you know, it's today it's a term which is a kind of, it's a difficult term to use. But I wonder if we can talk about the relationship between, say, the public sphere, which is this, you know, as Arendt speaks, this space where people come together in conflict, right? You know, to, in a sense, debate something. So it's the place where public opinion is formed. It's where issues emerge. And ultimately, in the best sense, it's where tolerance emerges, right? Through an appreciation, an understanding of difference. How do we understand the relationship between that public sphere and public space, which maybe we understand more traditionally? And I'm not speaking about like kind of like privately operated public space and these strange public-private partnerships that we know and love so well these days. But I mean, you know, this kind of classic notion of the square, right, or the plane here, you would say. Right? What is that relationship today, and how can we understand it in maybe a more precise way?
Well, that's a good question. I guess for Hannah Arendt, I mean, she particularly stressed that the physical meeting was actually very important for those spaces of conflict. So you had to be actually together to talk about everything. And
so in that sense, the two go hand in hand.
Yeah, the two were one.
Okay.
And of course, you know, with with the rise of the mass media, etc., and maybe also the specialized media. I mean, when we talk about public sphere, we wouldn't necessarily talk about public spaces, right? I mean, the public sphere is what's happening on television and in the newspapers or the internet or etc., but not so much on public space. Although it hasn't been ruled out completely. I mean, it's still an important place where people come together, and but not so much to confront their differences, but to make their own political position or to display their own identity. You know, I guess, but maybe this is way off. You know, the idealized public sphere by Arendt and also by Habermas and by Sennett is that also when you would enter this public sphere, you would set aside your private identity, and you would talk only about things that were in the, you know, in the common interest. I guess if you look at urban public sphere today, it's much more about, I mean, those two are not separated anymore. I mean, one of the pictures I put in the in my slideshow was from the summer carnival here in Rotterdam, which is a big manifestation of people from the what is it, the Pacific? No, not the Pacific. The Caribbean islands. Thank you. And in Amsterdam, one of the biggest events in the year is the gay parade. You know, it's showing to everyone who you are in public space, and maybe even public space is more important for that. I mean, also Saskia Sassen has pointed it out, that especially, for example, for immigrants, you know, in the United States a few years ago, we had big rallies of immigrants saying, you know, we want our rights. And the urban public sphere is the only place where they can actually do that, because they don't have access to, you know, they cannot vote for someone in Congress or et cetera, et cetera. So I'm thinking that the urban public space is still very much important, but not so much as a place where people with differences are coming together to overcome those differences, but as a place where people show or make a point of who they are and what they want.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead. There's a question here.
About media art and architecture. So 5 minutes back in the discussion, there was the question about how architects are dealing with the situation of media art being only temporary, 1 week, 3 months, maybe a year. And I think architects should address this in a way they've always addressed the public sphere or urbanism, as in facilitating different kind of usage. So when an architect makes a square or even an interior space in a building nowadays, it's not a single-use space anymore, unless we are really, really sure, like for houses, that they are going to be used for a few hundred years for one single function living. So if we make a square, it's a multifunctional space. But what I've seen in the past 15 years is when architects or like big firms put up media artworks in the public space, they spend hundreds of euros on a temporary work that's there indefinitely. And so my call to all architects is, unless you're really, really sure your media artwork is interesting indefinitely, facilitate changing work. So how do you see this? Should we make media art, or should we facilitate an ever-changing space where different kind of media art can continuously change?
Well, you know, there's a project at the San Jose airport which was kind of taken up by the city of San Jose, which really addresses this problem directly. I mean, the thing about media art today is that it's malleable, it's changeable, it's, you know, one to the extent that is dependent upon software instructions, which are, you know, do not require sort of committing material resources in a kind of permanent sense. The San Jose Airport developed a plan for having literally an infrastructure for which would support different kinds of more temporary exhibitions, right? Or pieces which, say, we're pulling on sort of, you know, the same data that's feeding the arrivals and departures information, or weather systems, or what have you. Excuse me. You know, I think so. Which is to say, sort of media art becomes, you know, more changeable and more ephemeral. That, you know, the opportunity is for architects, in a sense, in architecture, to understand what are the infrastructures, what are the necessary kind of canvases, let's say, that are required for this, and to look for the robustness of that and the kind of sort of permanence of that, rather than thinking about the permanence of the piece itself. Does that?
Yeah, that does answer the question.
Okay, thanks. Anyone in the audience? Martijn, was there anything that particularly triggered you in Mark's talk that you would like to speak about?
Not so much a question, but more of a comment, also relating back to some of the discussions that we were having earlier here. I think all of those projects have been very interesting, but I think Breakout is a project that's really interesting in terms of, you know, how do architects deal with space, or with urban space or urban planning on a more general level. I guess this is a very clear example where we're seeing how new technology, you know, the laptop and Wi-Fi internet, is changing the way that people are working. You know, no longer in the offices, but they're starting to work in public spaces. And that brings about a whole change in how people are using the city. And Breakout is trying to facilitate that process, and, you know, having people meet, have them interact with each other. Yet in one of the essays, Anne Galloway is actually criticizing this. She's saying, wait a minute, shouldn't we have a discussion first? Because now we're having all these people with laptops working in our public spaces. I don't want to be surrounded with people with laptops. I mean, it's bad enough that we're always working now because of these new technologies. So the status of, you know, what is public space and what are we entitled to do there, or what should be encouraged to do there. I think it's a very important discussion. Actually, I read an article in Amsterdam.
Martijn, please try to keep it brief, because we have to close it off not too long ago.
No, my closing comment was that I read an article in the newspaper in Amsterdam saying that at this moment our parks are being overcrowded. And that's because of people who are starting to work with laptops. Not only do they work with laptops, but they're also, because they're working by themselves, they're also meeting up with other people, not so much to work, but to have informal meetings, and they're doing that in the parks all the time. So our parks are now overcrowded because of this, so we need a whole new way of thinking of you know, urban planning and what kind of spaces we design.
We need more parks. Is that it?
Or maybe less Wi-Fi or more, I don't know.
Mark, would you have a last comment on that, please?
Okay, last comment. I mean, I guess, you know, if I were to make a last comment, I mean, I think it's becoming increasingly clear. I mean, cities are really complex things, right? I mean, they're economic systems, they're social systems, they're physical systems, and there are many different ways to kind of operate and intervene. And it would seem to me that if the question today is really about how does architecture engage with this kind of near future city, or the city which, as Martin is arguing, is already upon us, in fact, in many ways. It would seem to me that it's actually, you know, the people in this room, you guys, who are going to be responsible for addressing some of these conditions and defining how it is that architecture, you're mostly architects in this room, as we found out at the beginning, right? And so ultimately it's your generation which understands this condition as normal, on the one hand, sees it as a threat, in another hand, understands it as a formal proposition, right, or is looking for a formal and all of these are viable trajectories. The question is really how do we sort of get beyond the kind of preconceptions that we carry with us into this as what we think architecture is, and focus more on what we want it to become. Because I think in that way, we'll be able to produce and make significant contributions, alternative trajectories for the development of the city, which ultimately I would really argue is being predominantly developed along the lines of finding greater ways to consume and greater ways to control.
Right. With these last words, I would like to close off the admittedly quite short debate afterwards. I would also like you to thank you, the audience, for your questions and for your attention. Of course, give another big hand to our speakers, Mark Shepard, Martijn de Waal. And I would like to give the mic back to Michel from V2 to say a few final words.
Yeah, it leaves me as the host tonight to also thank you, our speakers, our moderator, Michiel de Lange, but also our kind partners in this event, Indecem 2011, and also the people that have been working on this event behind the stage, the crew here at V2. Many thanks for making the space look great, serving the drinks and everything. An applause for that as well, please. The book is available there at yours book stand if you're interested. And now let's go into the celebration part of this evening, which means finger food and CCTV cocktails for everyone. Thank you.